let me just start with a couple of words, very general introductory words about who Maurice Blanchot was. Blanchot is not very well known. Almost all of you probably will have heard of him in some capacity. But I hear over and over again with people talking to me, and I hear it all the time. People will say, well, I've read things about Blanchot, I've read this or that little thing by Blanchot, but I haven't been able to, or I haven't quite known how to proceed in really coming to grips with this text. I hear this all the time. So it is, I think it's striking and interesting. And if you look at the contemporary discussion in theory, you'll see Blanchot, and I say this actually contemporary, let's say any time since about 1985. Blanchot is a kind of shadowy presence on the margins, always there to some extent, and yet never quite there in the sense of a text that is debated, that is cited in a way that it would help advance a discussion, on any given topic. If one takes up Blanchot, it's kind of a pause, as opposed to a recognizable reference within the sort of theoretical field where positions are established. And I think well, I've been thinking about this a little bit recently, and I believe that one could describe this phenomenon in the following way. Blanchot is certainly one of those who made contemporary theory possible, and particularly in France, particularly in what became known as post-structuralism. For authors like Foucault or Deleuze or Derrida or Lacan, Blanchot was the author who introduced the question of literature and the question of literary language. Now, that's a little bit of an overstatement in that those authors were all reading Heidegger, for example, who was reading Hölderlin and other poets. So the question of poetry, a question of poetic language, literary language, had been introduced also by other paths, and I think Heidegger is a very important one for this question of philosophy in poetry or thought in poetry. But Blanchot had theorized these questions in ways that really quite exceeded anyone else, including Heidegger. Blanchot, as it happens, was very influenced by Heidegger, a very great reader of Heidegger throughout his career. And in some respects, this bringing of literary theory into this field of thought that became known as post-structuralism, it's very much Blanchot reading Heidegger and then pursuing his own literary practice and reflection. But Blanchot's writing by the 1970s and moving toward 1980, and particularly 1984 when he published The Writing of the Disaster, it had become fragmentary, among other things. And it did not lend itself to a theoretical elaboration or a theoretical summation. It was increasingly difficult to identify Blanchot within the field of theoretical references. He was, as I said, he was constantly present, but one couldn't easily, if you're trying to situate yourself in the theoretical field, one couldn't easily situate Blanchot. Texts like Lacan's text, Derrida's text, Foucault, Deleuze, each of them, represented, they were fields of theory in themselves, but to some extent, in those decades of the 80s and the 90s, you would recognize with them, speaking very crudely, a kind of position. But you couldn't bring Blanchot into that discussion in the same way. Something about Blanchot's text was recalcitrant in relation to this theorizing that was going on, this construction of a field. Each of those texts was recalcitrant to some extent. Lacan was very recalcitrant, Deleuze, and each of these are highly written texts that actually resist any kind of theoretical summation, or they're not positions, and if you read them as positions, you've actually reduced them rather severely. But that's how the field of theory was working, to construct these positions, to construct these almost as antagonistic sites of thinking. And to some extent they were antagonistic, but to a greater extent they were actually in a very interesting kind of proximity and interaction. But as I say, they lent themselves, I mean, to the possibility of a misnomer like post-structuralism. There was something about this theoretical activity that allowed for the construction of a field, for the construction of a kind of a public site. And Blanchot was very hard to draw into that field, except as to some extent, a necessary reference, but one that didn't carry with it a very clear theoretical affiliation. And as Blanchot's work progressed, I mean, most of those authors were extremely attentive to the earlier critical writings and literary works. Blanchot's first literary work was Thomas the Obscure, and that Lacan wrote a book about that, or lectured on that, became a published lecture. Foucault was writing about Blanchot, and they were attending very openly and strongly to the earlier work. The later work they were reading, but it wasn't appearing in discussion very much. And so, Le Pas au-delà, which is the text that I've been concentrating on in the last couple of years, which is translated as "Step Not Beyond," almost goes without citation. I mean, it was little segments, snippets of it would come out, or the whole interest in Nietzsche and the eternal return would be filtering through other texts, but you didn't get readings of Le Pas au-delà as a text. And the writing of The Disaster certainly had a bit more of attention, which was in 1984, but only in particular respects, only particular segments of that text came forth in public discussion. So there was we have in Blanchot's earlier work a kind of theory of criticism, theory of literature, or thinking about literature and criticism, which was to some extent identifiable, but then increasingly, as Blanchot progressed, increasingly difficult to summarize or to take on as some sort of position. So Blanchot is, I think that this partially accounts anyway for this curious effect that everyone has seen a little bit of Blanchot or heard of Blanchot or even maybe read a bit of Blanchot, but there are very few people who say, yes, I am a reader of Blanchot, or I've really, Blanchot is one of my key references. And I don't see any fault in that. It's just it has to do with this construction of the field and the way in which this field is presented in the academy and in the public sphere of publication and discussion. There is another element here. There are a couple other elements. Since I've been talking about the later Blanchot more, let me go to the second. The two things I want to describe are actually linked, and it's in a very interesting way. But Blanchot, for many people in France, anyway, in the starting already in the 60s, but in the 70s and then by the early 80s, Blanchot had such an aura about him as a writer and a thinker that he was extremely intimidating in the French context. I mean, people would not write about Blanchot for fear of looking like idiots. If you know the French, it's the same way with language. They won't speak English if they don't want to sound ridiculous. But being a little flippant, I don't think there are any French people here, so I was allowing myself that. But that's it. They were that way with Blanchot. I mean, you simply would not get very much discussion of Blanchot. People were afraid of how being perceived as inadequate to this kind of exalted text. And Nancy talks about that in one of the. He has had several sort of retrospective looks at his encounter with Blanchot around the question of community. And one of those, he says, when I wrote La Communauté désœuvrée, the unworking community, inoperative community, I received this response from Blanchot. I was extremely intimidated, and that is actually was a very common thing in France at that time. So there's a kind of silence around Blanchot, which is a kind of odd silence in that period. And this was, the second element of this was that Blanchot's political background was very troubling and a big question for everyone. Because in the 30s, Blanchot had been a journalist affiliated with the right wing. To some extent the extreme right, but I think he was flirting with some of the more revolutionary right, but he was he was very much affiliated with those authors trying to uphold the French nation, and from a Catholic background. So he was a nationalist, and he was always a fairly radical thinker in everything he did, and he had a very powerful political passion. So when he invested in this right-wing thinking in the 30s, he did so in a very uncompromised way. And there are some chilling statements that he made during that period, though a lot of it is really very much in the vein of a sort of a standard right-wing position, nationalist and Catholic, as I said. Somewhere around 1938 or 39, that's Blanchot's capacity to speak in that manner and that position was shaken. And it's not easy to... there's no clear history here as yet. There's a very good biography by Christophe Bident, B-I-D-E-N-T, that's in French. And then there's very good work by a guy by the name of Michael Holland, who's at Oxford, and then Leslie Hill, who's at Warwick. So there's been a lot of study of this material. A lot of the material has been published now and is available. But I don't think we could say that a prevailing reading has come into form. This period, 38 to 42 in particular, it's somewhat obscure. He was in Vichy. He saw when Pétain surrendered national sovereignty. He was there, apparently, in the room. He was still interacting with people who were active collaborators, but his activity in this is rather shadowy, and he was at the same time working with people in the resistance, so it's a rather difficult thing to define. But in this period, he was, I think it's around 1942, I'm trying to remember exactly, 41, 42, he met Georges Bataille. And in this period, the friendship with Bataille took on quite a strength. And they had a series of conversations. We know that there were these conversations. We know they happened fairly regularly. And from the testimony of Bataille, and just a little bit of Blanchot, but he was a very reserved man. But we know from Bataille that these conversations were immensely influential for Bataille himself, and the kind of very radical thinking that we associate with Georges Bataille. And what is a little bit less clear is what effect these conversations had on Blanchot. But when Blanchot emerged from the war period, he was clearly on the left, and was bringing his bringing his thinking, and I want to say, I'm saying just thinking, not just political thinking, but bringing his thinking into line with the rather radical writing that he had been doing in the 30s, not on the political side, not in the journalism, but in the literature. Because he started his first book, Thomas the Obscure, sometime in the early 30s. We don't really know when exactly, but in 1940 the first version was published, and it's about 280 pages or something. It's a dense and very experimental novel. It's to some extent it still adopts a novelistic form, but it is you can see the impact of surrealism and he's creating his own literary form. Thomas the Obscure is a very strange piece of work, and but when he at the end of the war, he he redid it. He gave a second version, which is about a quarter the size of the first, and it's quite fascinating. I mean, this is a project in itself. Just look at the transformation from the first version of Thomas the Obscure into the second, because in a sense that transition really gives us the becoming of Blanchot as we know him in the post-war period. But Thomas the Obscure, it's highly experimental, strange, extreme writing that was in Thomas the Obscure, is utterly incompatible with what he was doing in his right-wing journalism. And he was living a kind of skits. So he describes this himself. He said, I had a daytime existence and a nighttime existence. And the daytime existence is doing various kinds of writing activity. He was doing, I think he was working for an anthropologist for a little while. I mean, all sorts of things. He was making a living as a writer and also as a journalist. And then in the evening, he was writing in the sense that we come to associate with Maurice Blanchot, this very intense literary experimentation. And so he described himself as living a kind of split existence, and then sometime in the war, he says, he underwent a kind of conversion, and he was no longer able to sustain this duality or this split, and so the thinking, we might say, starts to come into line with the writing. There's his conversion is I suppose all his writing starts to converge in a project that we come to associate more easily with the name Maurice Blanchot. So we have, but in terms of his background in the French context, this was in the early 80s, the Heidegger affair had hit and had done considerable damage. Victor Farias's book was a revelation for a lot of people, although if you were working on Heidegger, you read most of the material had already been out. But it hadn't taken in a certain sense. And let me just pause for a second to talk about this, because it is a very interesting historical phenomenon. As I say, the Heidegger's Nazi involvement was certainly on the table from the post-war period on. I mean, he had to go through denazification proceedings that were run by the French, so there wasn't any mystery about who Heidegger was and what he had done. There was not very much information circulating as to just how actively he'd been involved and how actively he'd sought the rectoral position and so forth. I mean, this was the details of this were not very well known, but nobody was confused about his political commitments. But in the late 70s, early 80s, something occurred which is, I think, linked to the re-emergence of the question of the Shoah, and I'm using Claude Lanzmann's title there also to speak to a kind of sociocultural event whereby, by a kind of Nachträglichkeit, a kind of belatedness, French society started dealing with the fact of the Holocaust, of the Shoah. And so the publication of this material on Heidegger coincided with a renewed attention to the issue of Shoah. And in a certain sense then, Heidegger's politics, the way I tried to phrase it, they became newly legible, or they offered themselves to a new reading. And Blanchot got, in some sense, caught up in this, because people didn't know much about his activities in the 30s. They knew he was on the right wing. They did know that he had been friends with Levinas, which is a very interesting fact. He had been close friends with Levinas back in the 20s, when they were living in Strasbourg and both were studying Heidegger. And Blanchot had always been known as being perhaps a little philo-Semitic, and on the right wing this was a real problem. He had too many Jewish friends. But at the same time, some of his writings were ambiguous in this respect, and because he was engaging a discourse on the extreme right, where anti-Semitism was right. So there were a lot of questions, and there had this combination in the 70s, early 80s, of him being an extremely intimidating literary figure, for whom the most commanding presences were giving highest respect. I'm referring again to Lacan, Derrida, Deleuze, Foucault. I mean, all these the people who were sort of leading the leading figures in thinking at the time were saying, "This is the one that is informing us." So it was he was an intimidating figure, but at the same time he was a slightly scary figure. No one knew what was going to come out of the closet at any time with relation to Maurice Blanchot. So in the late 70s and early 80s there was a cautious silence in relation to Blanchot. Lacou-Labarthe and Nancy tried to put together a volume of the Cahiers de Lerne, which is a series. I think they're probably still being published, but the Cahiers de Lerne are publications devoted to a particular author or thinker or artist, and then they get the best writers they can find to put together a collection of essays on this individual. And they tend to be very good books, very good collections. And Lacou-Labarthe was asked, Nancy and Lacou-Labarthe together were asked to put one together in Blanchot, and they couldn't get people to contribute. There were just a few people who were willing to accept this request, but there were some surprising refusals, and so there was Blanchot was not to be touched a little bit in the late 70s and 80s, and through the 80s, 90s, and the beginning of the century. This uneasiness continued, and it's been a slow process of sort of bringing back Blanchot into discussion, and in part that entails really getting a view of what was happening in the 30s and the 40s, and at the same time reading the text more seriously, more attentively, more thoroughly. And so what we're seeing today, I think, is something of a return, or something of a renewal of interests. Leslie Hill has written a beautiful book, which just came out 2 weeks ago. Maurice Blanchot and Fragmentary Writing, and I would recommend that to you very strongly. There are little signs here and there of kind of a renewed capacity to read Blanchot, but Blanchot is very much coming into reading in a way that is I think, new. So let me just add a couple words to what I've said. I think I've given you a bit of a sketch of Blanchot's position in modern French thought. The first big literary text is Thomas the Obscure. Then in the post-war period, there were two books in particular that were, especially important for literary theory and literary thinking. Those were L'Espace Littéraire, first of all, the literary space, and the other was Le Livre à Venir, the book to come. Two very significant collections of essays that were marking for the French context.
So which was the second one?
Le Livre à Venir, the book to come. There were a number of others. A book called The Part du Feu, the Share of Fire, as it's been translated. L'Amitié, Friendship. I'm forgetting several collections, but what I want to stress there is those two, particularly those two collections. And the fact that through this period, what am I saying? Through the 40s, the 50s, and the 60s, Blanchot was writing on a weekly basis different review essays, and sometimes more reflective essays, but he was writing for the Nouvelle Revue Française in the NRF for a very long period, and just commenting on all of the major European writing of the time, or of the century. He has, the production of literary thinking is absolutely staggering when you look at the number of publications. And these critical engagements are quite distinctive because he was a fantastic reader, and at the same time, when you read Blanchot reading Gide or any number of German authors, Rilke or whatever, it's always Blanchot reading Gide or Rilke or others. So there's a very distinctive turn of thought going on. but it was massive, a fantastic level of production. So Blanchot was also always present in that sense too. There was in the leading literary publications of the day. So he was then in the 40s, the 50s, and the 60s. He was publishing literary criticism. Let's just call it literary theory. A literary theory that was philosophically charged. He was also, a very intense reader of modern European philosophy and literary work. He was continuing to do kind of very experimental writing, but experimental, but at the same time strangely beautiful writing. And which was, so when you evoke, when one evoked the name Blanchot in the post-war period, one was referring to a literary critic and a writer, and perhaps first of all a writer. I think Blanchot's preeminence remained always that of a writer. So he had an almost sovereign position in French letters in the post-war period, all the while attempting to deconstruct the notion of sovereignty and authority, and increasingly advocating a kind of anonymity in the experience of writing. So the death of the author is a theme that's certainly very easily linked to Blanchot's work. And he was, as I said, productive for many decades there. So it's a large body of work, and an extremely rich body of work, and an extremely difficult body of work. And all of this, I think, contributes to this vagueness of who Blanchot is. Right? It's quite a career, and it's quite a variegated career, and it's quite difficult material. But it is, at the same time, I just threw that, it is very beautiful material, and it's very easy to become captivated by Blanchot's writing, and to find oneself on an irreversible course in reading this material. So I'm attempting to seduce you and give you this strange passion of Blanchot's writing. Any questions about that, or any obscurities there?
Would Blanchot have considered himself an atheist, do you think?
Well, there's in the essay on Judaism that I was referring to last night, Blanchot is very close, when he speaks of conversion, he is very close to converting, actually, in relation to Judaism. And yet he doesn't make that step. And when he writes about Levinas and he writes about Judaism, he says that he brackets the question of God. He refuses to take up the name of God in relation to his reflection of Judaism. I think this refusal is pretty, how can I say, it is severe and sustained. Now, does that make him an atheist? He would never have said, I'm an atheist. But I would say that the thinking is atheistic in that he is constantly suspending this reference to God, or refusing to take that route.
Thank you.
So it is an atheist writing. Whether, was he atheist? So someone who comes out of a very powerful Catholic background, who felt that an engagement with Judaism was, in some respects, essential in the post-war period, after what had happened. That makes the question a difficult one to answer. But I would say yes, it is an atheistic text.